supposed to be spring. um, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it. So I appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day to join us for this next approximately 1 hour for this presentation. So what we're going to be talking about today is mindful and intuitive eating. We're going to go a little bit more in depth in terms of these concepts. And a lot of times these terms are used interchangeably. So we're going to take a look at what are the distinctions between these two concepts, the differences and the similarities is there. As well as some practical tips to kind of keep along the way as well too. I find that a lot of times within my profession and just nutrition in general, a lot of the topic of conversation is regarding what we eat, but not necessarily so much about how and why. So definitely a really interesting topic and a topic that I'm definitely passionate about. I'm really excited to share about with you today. So let's take a look here. So just kind of taking a look. So thank you, Noreen, for giving that really nice introduction. With this, again, I don't necessarily want to talk so much about myself and how to necessarily condense who you are in one slide. But again, I will say overall in terms of my experience, again, I've been a dietitian for going on 5 years at this point. And what I really love about this field is it's not, just a science, it's also an art as well. I don't claim to know everything, and I keep constant learning within this field, and also learning from other people I speak with from all walks of life, different professions, different cultures as well, and how their relationship with food is, or what their specific goals are as well too. And I think ultimately it is a really beautiful thing. I don't have any needles or any diagnosis. It's really that effective conversation I think is so beneficial, and one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this field. And I look forward to getting to know a lot more about you today as well. So as Noreen was mentioning, totally up to you if you want to participate in the chat, or if you prefer today that that's not necessarily what I'm feeling, can absolutely feel more than welcome to just listen and watch, whatever you feel most comfortable with as well too. Right. So in terms of our outline today, so we're going to start off with a little bit in terms of the introduction regarding mindful and intuitive eating. What exactly are they, and what are the key differences there to keep in mind as well? Especially as we're going to be further expanding upon these concepts in terms of forming a more positive relationship with food and some practical suggestions. It's going to be important to know what that key distinction there as well. And with forming a positive relationship with food, we're going to be touching upon just some of the concepts from intuitive eating that I'll be discussing briefly within the next slide. Becoming more attuned with your hunger and fullness cues, and some habits you can start today as well. I'll also finish off today with a couple of resources that might be helpful as well. So just kind of pinpointing what might be effective for you at this point in time. All right. So before we can even talk about the concept of mindful eating, I think it's important to discuss what exactly is mindfulness overall. So John Kabat-Zinn, who's often considered the father of mindfulness, defines mindfulness as awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And if there's one keyword to remember throughout this presentation is really that non-judgmentally is really going to be popping up there as well. Now, of course, I do recognize viewing things from a non-judgmental lens is absolutely easier said than done. As we navigate throughout our lives, I think for a lot of us, we tend to be our own worst critics. And again, this is definitely not an overnight thing as well. So again, just kind of unraveling that and really kind of getting curious in terms of where that judgment comes from and building more towards that non-judgmental perspective as well. So essentially observing those thoughts and feelings without necessarily viewing them as good and bad. So on top of a lot of us being our own worst critics, it can be really easy to compartmentalize things in terms of good or bad, right? Again, it's just a lot more easier and straightforward to kind of categorize these things. But again, unlearning that and getting curious about how those things came about within ourselves as well can definitely be a really important thing as well too. And as I mentioned before, absolutely not an overnight thing as well. So taking a look at overall in terms of mindfulness, how does that come about in terms of mindful eating? So mindful eating is essentially about using mindfulness to reach a state of full attention to your experiences, cravings, and your physical cues within eating as well. And throughout the presentation, we'll go through just a little bit more in terms of details regarding that and overall, what exactly does that mean in terms of that overall eating experience? Maybe some things that can be quite obvious to us, or maybe some things that we don't necessarily pay attention to as well. Now, taking it one step further, intuitive eating is going to be a little bit beyond that. So you can kind of think about mindfulness and mindful eating as almost that baseline. And intuitive eating kind of takes that a little bit one step forward. Intuitive eating is more so a framework that was created by two dietitians in the US, Evelyn Chibble and Elise Resch. And basically, their framework is going to be involving focusing, letting go of dieting, and becoming more of an intuitive eater. I will preface, especially with the timing of this presentation, you can do an entire presentation within even some of the principles within intuitive eating, an entire course with this. Again, it's definitely a really big concept and a really big rabbit hole as well too. But we'll definitely take a look at some of the elements there as well. But it's basically going to be based on 10 principles of intuitive eating. So we'll briefly go over those a little bit right now, and then just kind of take it from there. Number one being rejecting the diet mentality, honoring your hunger and being a little bit more in tune of where your hunger is rooted from, whether it's that physical hunger or a non-physical type of hunger. Making peace with food and giving yourself permission to eat, not necessarily there's any foods off limits as well. So you can kind of see there's almost that interconnection when we're talking about mindfulness, again, observing those thoughts and feelings rather than judging them as necessarily good or bad. Challenging the food police. So that can be either internal or external. There's so much nutrition messaging and so much messaging out there as well. But kind of recognizing, from all those food rules that I learned from, where did I learn that from? How does that reflect in terms of kind of moving forward with that as well? Overall, respecting your fullness as well too, and kind of getting into those feelings. The satisfaction factor as well. So even going beyond specifically what a meal is composed of or a snack is composed of, is there a social experience to this? Do I even like the flavor, the different textures of that food experience as well? I think for a lot of times we tend to kind of forget that element as well too. Coping with feelings without using food. We'll go a little bit more in depth. There's a separate slide regarding this, but I will preface by saying that not necessarily that we can never respond to any emotions with food, but just making sure that that's not necessarily the only response to that as well. Respecting your body as well. So understand that we do come in all different shapes and sizes. And there's so many factors that go into that as well too. Joyful exercise rather than exercise as a chore or for punishment as well. So recognizing that that movement and that exercise that really brings that additional joy to it, that would be genuinely enjoyable as well. And then the last principle is honoring your health or gentle nutrition. Also, concepts kind of get used interchangeably. Again, gentle nutrition can be an entire different presentation or a course as well too. But basically it comes down to honoring your health and taste buds while making you feel good as well. Not necessarily that you have to eat perfectly, however your definition of that is, to be healthy. But as that's quoted from their intuitive eating website, it's all about progress, not perfection is what counts as well too. And we'll go a little bit more in depth just briefly in terms of gentle nutrition a little bit later on in the presentation as well. All right, so I do recognize that is a very long spiel in terms of the Clip Notes version of mindful eating and intuitive eating. So how do we kind of consolidate these together? So overall, what are the similarities between the two? So both of them are going to recognize that there's no specific overall eating pattern. It doesn't necessarily come down to, okay, 3 meals per day, 3 snacks per day. Even if we do a quick Google search, all these, generic plans and stuff as well. There really isn't any some specific in terms of a meal pattern regarding these. Both of them reflect on how you engage with food, your body, and your overall like, eating experience as well. So you may have noticed as I was going through some of the principles of intuitive eating, there was a lot of overlap with some of those key factors regarding mindfulness as well too. So as I mentioned before, mindful eating, it's kind of like that baseline, and then intuitive eating just kind of takes that one step forward as well. And of course, focusing on those internal cues of appetite. But what are the differences overall? So mindful eating, there's going to be a little bit more of that emphasis on that eating experience in that non-judgmental way. So as I mentioned before, non-judgment is going to be a key word to remember when it comes to mindful eating, and it's definitely popping up even close to early on in this presentation. But then intuitive eating is going to be more so a broader framework that's going to take it that next level to challenge diet messaging and overall culture as well. Basically, the easiest way to think about it, as from these previous slides, is that intuitive eating is essentially not possible without mindfulness overall. So when we talk about the eating experience, what exactly do we mean by that? So when we are having that meal or having that snack, maybe some key things to kind of pay attention to as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be all inclusive of all this. It could be even maybe something that you're already doing, or maybe something that you'd be interested in doing, or maybe something that you haven't done in a while as well. So it can really come down to why you feel like eating, what emotions or needs might be triggering that eating at that point in time. And as I mentioned before, again, when we're kind of taking a look at those different principles of intuitive eating, not necessarily that there's anything wrong or that we can never respond to emotions, whether positive or negative to food, making sure that that's not the only thing in our toolkit as well. And again, those experiences are completely valid. And I really want to mention that as well. Food, it doesn't reject us. It's not privy to our interpersonal mistakes and shortcomings as well, but maybe something to get curious about over time as well. Paying also attention to what you're eating, whether it nourishes your body, maybe get an idea of, when they have a certain food or a certain meal, certain snack, do I necessarily feel energized afterwards? Do I notice any patterns with that? Perhaps the look, the smell, the taste, or the feeling of the food that you're eating as well. How it makes you feel as you taste it, as you digest it, and even throughout the day. So even, not necessarily 5 minutes afterwards, but if you're having that lunch break, is that really providing that feel for me or that energy that maybe I wasn't necessarily expecting? Your emotions before, during, and after eating as well. And perhaps where that food came from and who might have grown it as well. Switching gears a little bit here as well. So we've been talking a little bit about the eating experience and kind of those similarities and differences between mindful eating and intuitive eating as well. So maybe perhaps the best intuitive eaters could be actually children as well. So it is thought that young children are believed to have an innate capacity to self-regulate their food intake by following their internal signals of hunger and fullness. There was a study done back in the 80s by Birch and Dasher, where they were taking two groups of children and adults between their mid-20s to mid-30s. Just gave them a lunchtime break, a large variety of food, and just no rules, just eat what you like as well. And children had more of a capacity to just eat what they needed and stop when they were feeling full. However, for the adults, it was a little bit different as well. And we can imagine that as well too, right? Over time, not going to be children anymore. There's going to be things that are going to affect overall that food intuition as well. So as an example, based on our different lived experiences, it could be something like being praised for finishing the plate, or perhaps being scolded for not finishing your plate at a meal as well, depending on that dynamic that we've experienced growing up as well. Using food to cope with emotions, whether they could be positive or negative. Labeling foods as necessarily good or bad. There can be multiple factors that go into that as well too. Judgment from peers, whether especially in schools and growing up, and then really internalizing that judgment as well, based on other foods or foods they weren't necessarily familiar with, or even judgment in terms of the quantity of the food eating as well. Again, even those things that are just kind of those comments on the side, it can absolutely have effect of us over time as well too. Even think about things that happened years ago. Again, that kind of still sticks with us as well, right? Hiding foods or eating in privacy, and ultimately contributing to any sort of factors that contribute to that unhealthy relationship with food as well. Right. So, how do we kind of start planting that seed in terms of forming a positive relationship with food? And again, as I mentioned before, this is absolutely not an overnight thing. You kind of pick and choose in terms of what would be the most useful thing for you at this point in time, or even if it's one thing, or even something to adapt as well. Again, especially when these are things that are a combination of our own individual experiences. Again, it's one of those things that definitely takes that time and that patience and also that kindness towards ourselves as well. So this is basically going to touch upon a little bit more in depth when we're going a little bit through those 10 principles of intuitive eating, just a couple of them as well, but maybe some key things to keep in mind overall. All right. So first one being making peace with food as well. So again, with a lot of us, it can be kind of easy just to kind of put things into boxes, even going beyond a food perspective as well. A lot of times, the perception that maybe a certain food is off limits, or if I were to have something, that there's those feelings of guilt or any sort of other negative emotions as well too. That can trigger eating beyond what maybe our body needs beyond that particular moment as well, right? And really focusing on that unconditional permission to eat can reduce that likelihood as well. So not necessarily leaving those things as why they're good or bad, or, if I'm craving this, it is okay to have that within my week, within my lifestyle as well. It can also kind of help in terms of giving you a little bit more of that power versus giving food that power as well. Kind of sometimes that over restriction can make that desire to rebel just a little bit stronger as well. So maybe something to reflect upon is, can you think of a time when you told yourself you couldn't have something only to crave it later? I'll even share my personal experience here. So at the beginning of the presentation, we're giving a little bit of a background in terms of, my journey to becoming a dietitian. So during my undergrad, especially, studying nutrition, a lot of people that I interacted with in my life would have certain perceptions of me, or really make judgments in terms of, oh, she must be doing everything perfect. She must have the perfect diet, which again, that's a lot of pressure to live up to overall. And again, it's not fair at the end of the day. And so I remember living off campus for about my second year. And my mom always loves to bake, right? And it's a really big part of that culture that I grew up in as well, too. There's also that nostalgia that goes beyond that, even going beyond specifically what that food is made of. It's something that's special to me as well. And this one weekend where she was visiting me, she made this very long apple strudel that I could kind of bring with me, especially this was kind of like during midterm season, which that's a word that I have not used in years. But again, just something to kind of help with studying as well too, just something to kind of snack on as well. Of course, you've got the apples in there, you have that nice crust. There's going to be, icing sugar in there, brown sugar in there. And somebody that I was acquainted with at that point in time had really judgmental comments about what I was eating or what I was having in the home as well, just in terms of, why are you eating that? That's gross. You're basically no nutrition. Or, you're a nutrition student. How could you be having something as well? And absolutely no kidding. Again, even though I initially brushed that off, again, it was just one of those things where it just really bothered me and just kind of stuck with me. And, as and unexpected, it started to affect me as well. So, it got to the point where I just told my mom, hey, just don't bring any sort of desserts. I don't need it as well. Now, over a couple of months as well, too, I just couldn't stop thinking about that apple strudel as well, right? Now, I know moving forward in time as well, I will say, in terms of that acquaintance, somebody that I don't necessarily interact with anymore, we don't need that negative energy in our life. And I still have that apple strudel back in my life as well, too. But I could kind of see again with completely avoiding something, or, having that memory really implanted in me, how that affected my overall relationship with food, and also that craving that I had afterwards as well. So maybe something to kind of reflect upon as well too, in terms of our experiences as well. All right. Another aspect as well too is honoring your feelings without food. And I've mentioned this multiple times throughout this presentation, and I will mention it again. There is absolutely nothing quote unquote wrong with responding to an emotion, whether positive or negative, with food. But we just want to make sure overall, this is not the only tool that you have within your toolkit. And again, this absolutely does take time, but it can be something in terms of even going beyond specifically, what can I do in response to my emotions, is maybe getting a little bit in tune of what am I feeling and what do I need at this point in time. For some of us attending this presentation today, we immediately know what that answer is. For other of us that are also maybe joining this presentation, maybe we don't know an answer to that, or maybe it might take months or years to know an answer to that as well. And those experiences are all absolutely completely valid as well. Now on the slide over here, it just kind of give a little bit of just examples in terms of, again, if I'm feeling stressed, anxious, or upset, what are maybe some things I can add into my toolkit? And I also want to emphasize, not necessarily that everybody has to include all of these. And especially when I'm having conversations with anybody I'm working with, I always mention that this is never a recommendation that I can specifically make for anybody. Number one, it has to be something that you would genuinely enjoy and something that would absolutely fit within your life as well. So again, this definitely does take time to overall think about as well. But again, it has to be something that's personable, and it has to be something that is also enjoyable as well. So again, those could be a couple of examples there as well. So rest, relaxation, listening to music, spending time out with friends. But I also recognize, again, with a lot of these options, sometimes depending on our own individual circumstances, these options may not necessarily be accessible as well, right? So, and again, with a lot of those things as well too, big elephant in the room is, over the past couple of years, also navigating this pandemic, we've been deprived of a lot of things within our lives, things that we didn't have that opportunity to do, things that just kind of put on pause as well. But if this is an accessible option for you, maybe something to kind of think about is in terms of, maybe something that I've always wanted to do, but I just never had time to do it. Or, something that, I used to maybe do a couple of years ago. Maybe I'd be interested in kind of bringing that back into my life. But again, something that can kind of go at your own pace as well too. Again, there's never any right or wrong answers when it comes to this. Another thing as well too is respecting hunger and fullness as well. Research shows that it takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes for our stomach to register that fullness physiologically as well. Now, let's kind of take a step back here, because again, recognizing that sometimes that may not necessarily be an accessible option for everybody. A lot of the conversations with people that I'll speak with, especially with different job roles that I've had, currently in the past as well, they'll sometimes mention that there isn't necessarily an opportunity for them to eat, or depending on their family dynamic, depending on their work dynamic, where they only have 5 minutes to themselves. That's really only that time that they can kind of get that food and that nourishment in. Sometimes it may not necessarily be that option there as well. But again, maybe kind of taking a look at, are there opportunities where not necessarily that I have to eat so slow in such a cumbersome way every single time, because absolutely that may not necessarily be the most practical suggestion at this point in time, but are there some opportunities here where I just have maybe a little bit more control within my situation as well? So overall, maybe eating a little bit slower, but also in a natural way as well. So no need to eat in a way that's, uncomfortably slow or very unnatural to you as well. Especially for anybody that I speak with, where they'll mention, I've always been a fast eater. Again, especially when that's been a lifelong thing as well too. Again, it does not have to be a complete rush and that all or nothing thinking as well. But again, even kind of slowing that at pace in a situation that is comfortable for you and accessible for you, this can absolutely give you a nice opportunity just to check in a little bit more with your satiety cues as well. Finishing up with this section as well too. So that aspect of intuitive eating, respecting your hunger and your fullness cues as well. A tool that some people find really helpful is the hunger scale. So this is one of the resources that we have at One Elephant. And I don't know about you folks, but anytime I'm filling out a survey where it asks me to, okay, from a scale of 1 to 10, how did you feel about this? Or how would you rate this? I always get a little bit flustered, and I always think to myself, okay, I don't know if that's a 5 or a 6 to me. That there's not really any difference there as well. It kind of feels a little bit arbitrary. So if you're looking for something a little bit more specific, this can definitely be a helpful tool as well. So not anything to necessarily journal if that's not something you want to do, or even just something to kind of keep a mental note of. But basically what the hunger scale looks like is on a scale of 1 to 10, how hungry am I? But again, maybe some specific indicators that come with that as well. So it goes, so on the lower end of the scale, so 1, 2, and 3, it's going to be a little bit more on that hunger. And then as it comes to the upper end of that scale, 8, 9, and 10, it's going to be a little bit more in terms of those feelings of fullness as well too. Usually what we try to go over throughout time is making sure that within our hunger and our fullness, we stay around that 3 to 7. But again, these things do take time overall. But even as a starting point, kind of reflecting on, again, how hungry am I feeling? Or how full do I feel afterwards? Is it comfortable kind of fullness? Does it get to the point where it's an uncomfortable kind of fullness? Are there any factors that may have contributed to that as well, right? As example, if I'm traveling and I'm feeling a little bit jet lagged, or if there was just a lot of things that were going on with my work day and I didn't have time for lunch, that just wasn't an option for me. I didn't take a break, and it's almost as if my appetite is kind of catching up with me. Again, that can be kind of a helpful tool in noticing those different patterns that we're experiencing within our day-to-day as well. And just a little bit more of a piece in terms of, okay, if I want to think about 1 to 10, maybe just something that's a little bit more concrete and kind of reflecting on that as well too. So again, maybe it's kind of, a helpful tool kind of moving forward with that as well too, especially if you want something that's a little bit more specific, you can kind of help in terms of that sense as well. All right. So taking a look at those previous aspects, it was just a little bit more in depth in terms of some of those key principles within intuitive eating, and going a little bit more in the information regarding that as well. So what are maybe some actionable tips that you can start mindfully eating today as well? All right. So definitely turning off technology can definitely be a really important step here as well. Now, I recognize, again, even what we're doing right now, a lot of what we have to do within our day to day and our week to week does require us having to look at a screen, especially with, a lot of screen devices in cars nowadays if we're commuting, even within my own job and a lot of dietitian jobs as well, when we're meeting with people virtually as well. There's no way around it. It is what it is, but kind of think about circumstances where if I do have an opportunity to eat and move away from that screen, does that necessarily make a difference as well? So physical distractions that can definitely be that biggest pull away from mindful eating. So maybe something to reflect upon is, what distractions do I experience when I am eating meals as well? A lot of times I'll hear from people, they'll mention, you know what, it's just a lot more efficient for me just to get my work done. I'll just quickly snack on something. And then that way I don't feel as though I'm necessarily quote unquote wasting time as well. So I completely feel as though that's definitely a really valid experience as well. But maybe something to kind of challenge a little bit of that is I'm kind of thinking about a conversation that I had with a client a couple months ago as well. So I'm not sure within Zoom if it's a little bit obvious with how I'm speaking right now, or if you're necessarily concentrating too much on my teeth. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I currently do wear Invisalign. I was speaking with somebody that was also wearing Invisalign at that same time. So if you're not 100% familiar with it, basically what it comes down to is you need to be wearing your clear plastic, your trays, your clear braces, approximately 22 hours per day. If you don't, your teeth are not necessarily going to move. So you basically, if you do the math, have about a 2-hour window to eat if you want to be 100% compliant with this as well. And so one of the things that he was mentioning to me is, he had that mindset of, okay, if I just eat and do my work. Again, that's a very efficient way. You're kind of killing two birds with one stone. But then he did download an app just to kind of get an idea of, okay, approximately how long does it take me to comfortably eat a meal within a certain amount of time? Do I necessarily feel satisfied and full afterwards as well? So, and again, he just started doing this at the beginning point, but he realized, you know what, it actually doesn't take me that long to eat a meal within my particular pace. It doesn't really take that excessive amount of time. And I found once I moved away from that screen and I was able to finish that meal, not only did I feel a little bit more productive, there's also that enjoyment there as well. And because I didn't necessarily have that additional mental thought process of what I have to do on this particular computer screen, my life is on there, I felt as though that I had a little bit more of that satisfaction overall with that meal and being a little bit more in tune with that eating experience as well. So maybe, again, something to try out as well. Not necessarily a common recommendation I would make to everybody, just start timing your meals as well. That might not necessarily be the most practical suggestion, but maybe something to get curious about as well too, where if there is a circumstance where you might have a little bit more control within this, just kind of time it and see, does that make a difference? And maybe what is overall my definition of productivity as well. Another suggestion as well is even pausing between bites. That really slows down overall that eating process as well and really increases that mindfulness during that eating. Again, we have a little bit more of that time of reflection in terms of enjoying that overall eating experience and kind of think about some of those questions that we were talking about earlier on within our presentation as well. So instead of, putting up the fork as you chew, wait until you finish each bite and just get it ready for that another one as well too. So again, even involving a little bit more of that sensory experience as well. I recognize, again, as a dietitian, a lot of what I talk about, a lot of what dietitians talk about is, of course, what we eat, that meal composition, that stock composition. There is value within that conversation, but I think a lot of times, that underrated conversation is, of course, that sensory experience. Meals, there's so much more to that composition. There's that texture, that flavor, and all that great stuff there as well. All right. Also, taking one step further, making that first bite mindful as well. So again, it doesn't have to necessarily have to be an all or nothing approach. Again, some of those keywords, non-judgmental, things take time as well. But again, smaller steps are bigger than none. So even just kind of focusing on earlier on within that meal or snack and kind of building off from there can definitely be helpful as well. So again, pausing before digging in, putting away all distractions in a way that's accessible for you as well, and kind of making note of that sensory experience, that smell, taste, texture, feelings, emotions, all that great stuff. All right. And of course, further building a nutrition inventory. So this further expands upon that last principle of intuitive eating, gentle nutrition. As I mentioned before, this can be a really big rabbit hole to kind of dive into as well. But just to kind of recap, gentle nutrition is basically honoring your health and your taste buds while making you feel good at the end of the day. And so, again, kind of taking a step back, I am reminded of when I am speaking with people from, different cultures as well. And a lot of times I'll hear from people who mention, especially if there were, times in their childhood where they weren't feeling sick, their parent or guardian would make them something that would kind of help them during that time as well. And there's that nostalgia factor in there as well. There's that emotional tie into that as well. Or again, even just a particular food or particular go-to snack that I just know when I have that, I just feel a lot better as well too. Or something that just really reminds me of growing up or that culture as well. A lot of times, that can kind of go on the wayside, especially when, we are surrounded by a lot of mixed diet messaging, mixed nutrition messaging, and also being constantly bombarded with that diet culture as well. Even if it's especially something that doesn't necessarily fit into a Eurocentric mold as well. Again, what your personal nutrition inventory, that's something that's, again, there's no right or wrong answers here. It's all completely up to you. And it's what personally makes you feel good at the end of the day. So even kind of taking a look at, again, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but thinking about, when I think about kind of my go-to meals, my go-to snacks, those go-to ingredients, what are some things that really are of such value to me in terms of energy, or, if I'm incorporating that joyful movement, things that really fuel my exercise. And even from a preventative health perspective as well, right? So I'm sure, I get a lot of these questions. I'm sure Nuri gets these questions as well, but I'll definitely have people that mention, what, I always grew up with this food, but like, does this even have any nutrients in there? I've always heard that it's quote unquote unhealthy. And hey, a lot of times in that conversation, surprising, this might be a rich food in this key nutrient that maybe wasn't necessarily associated with that as well, right? So definitely kind of a nice conversation to have with a dietitian as well, kind of exploring that together. But again, even kind of building that nutrition inventory, even with any of these other steps, can be something that can be, something nice to reflect on, and also even an enjoyable exercise as well. All right. Now, a couple of mindful eating myths. I hear these a lot just in terms of understandable barriers as well too. So definitely myth number one, think that you must eat in total solitude. Now, if I told people that, okay, in order to mindfully eat, you need to shut off all technology, silent room, absolutely quiet, I don't think people would like me very much. So it doesn't necessarily require your entire full intention. But again, kind of linking this back with what I was mentioning at the beginning of our conversation, it's more getting to that overall eating experience. So again, the flavor, the texture, your feelings of hunger, your feelings of fullness before, during, and afterwards as well. Especially if I'm speaking with somebody that lives alone as well too, absolutely do not need to eat in complete solitude. You can absolutely have, music in the background, or any other things to kind of help with that sensory experience as well. Myth number two is also mindful eating necessarily means that I'm going to be automatically eating less as well too. So this myth kind of plays falls into the idea that if you're fully paying attention to your fullness signals and your hunger signals, then logically you'll be eating significantly less as well too. But that's not necessarily the case. And again, mindful eating is going to more so be involved in terms of focusing on things from a non-judgmental stance as well. And also something to keep in mind is that our feelings of hunger and fullness, they're not going to be static. It's not going to be the same thing every single day. There's so many factors that go into this as well, right? So as an example, on a day where I am moving a lot more versus on a day where I'm sitting a lot, which is the nature of a lot of a dietitian's job as well. Again, my appetite is going to be different as well too. Also, from a women's health perspective, changes in hormones are absolutely going to have an impact in terms of our appetite, changes with that, and our hunger and fullness cues as well. So it doesn't necessarily come down to, okay, my hunger and fullness is going to be the same every single day, but viewing that in a non-judgmental way, and maybe the reasons behind that as well, right? Again, our bodies are smart. They're always looking for that backup and really being mindful of those needs as well too. And of course, myth number three, I'm too busy to be mindful. Again, completely valid barrier as well. But even if it comes down to not necessarily, taking any of the suggestions that we talked about today, right, this evening or tomorrow as well, but even something of those reflection sizes can, again, just kind of get that ball rolling there as well. Or if it's something that you're really curious about, again, kind of that Invisalign mealtime example as well, can be worth a shot as well too. But again, understandably, with a lot of things that we have with going within our day-to-day and our week-to-week, again, it can kind of feel as though maybe understandably a little bit scary in terms of questions that I've never asked myself, experiences that I don't necessarily want to think about. And again, that's completely valid as well. Everybody's on our own nutrition journey. Everybody goes at their different pace. And again, there's never anything right or wrong way to do things as well too. So hopefully that kind of covers that in terms of those common myths there as well. All right. With that being said, I'll kind of finish off a little bit in terms of some mindful, intuitive eating resources that really go in depth in terms of these concepts as well. With this presentation, again, we're kind of planting the seed in terms of, getting things started, maybe some things that you can incorporate to start things off as well. But if you are interested in any more information regarding these concepts, a couple of books and some apps as well, definitely take a look at the Intuitive Eating book, the original one by Evelyn Tribble, Melise Resch. I have a copy of it myself, and it's a really great read. They talk about their personal experience as dietitians, working with clients, and really an evidence-based practice as well, and kind of diving in a little bit more in terms of those 10 principles within intuitive eating as well. Even going beyond that, there's also the intuitive eating workbook from colleagues that I've spoken with that have recommended this. Anecdotally, they've mentioned that with people they've worked with, they've absolutely loved it, especially if this is something that you really want to dive in more towards as well. This can be just a nice way to kind of reflect on those activities and really kind of work towards that as well too. So definitely a really great book resources there as well. Now, if you're looking for maybe something a little bit more technology based as well, again, the future is now there's a lot of great apps out there as well. One of them being the Mindful Eating Coach number 2, a little bit of a strange title to it, but it's actually a really great app. If you go in the App Store, it has the icon of basically like a slice of an orange. And it allows you to notice a food idea or a thought, rate and track levels of gratitude, hunger, thirst, satisfaction, and food enjoyment as well. And it also incorporates, I guess, perhaps from the last time I tried the app, a little bit in terms of the hunger scale. So again, if using that as a mental note may not necessarily be the most practical for you, and you feel as though, okay, having that visually on an app would be a nice way to have that, that can absolutely be a great way to kind of incorporate that, and what's another app on your phone, right? Another thing I've also heard, I personally haven't used it myself, but I learned this from a colleague. If journaling, using something like a diary is something that's helpful for you, and I do get mixed reactions on this. Some people really love this. Some people don't necessarily want to have that additional thing to do as well. There is the 8 food diary. It doesn't necessarily focus on, particularly numbers or anything, but it's more of a photo food journal. So they can kind of maybe taking foods in terms of meals, snacks that you have, and additional things to kind of reflect on that as well too. And you kind of build something beautiful in terms of maybe particular events that were associated with the meal, maybe who we're having that meal with, whether it's friends, family. Again, there's a social context to food that we can't necessarily ignore as well. So kind of something that's customizable, and it's really user friendly from what I've heard as well. If you're looking for something even going on that's very targeted specifically for intuitive eating, mindful eating, there's also the app Buddhify. It's a meditation app, and it also has specifically eating meditations as well. So kind of a little bit more of that baseline in terms of mindfulness as well. So whatever would be the most accessible for you, whatever you personally feel at this point in time you would want to get started off with, or even some things where, maybe I don't want to get started off with anything, and maybe just something to kind of think about as well. Again, this is your own journal, and this is personal at the end of the day as well. But again, maybe just some key resources to keep in mind as well too. So with that being said, again, as I mentioned before, what is time? We're almost at 1 hour, so I'll switch gears here as well. I'll stop sharing my screen at this point in time. And in case if anybody has questions, you can definitely type that into the chat. Or unmute as well too. We'd have a couple more minutes within our Tuesday evening as well. So I'll give everybody some time. And maybe sip some water as well too.
Just going to pop on here and say thanks. That was really, really informative. And we have some comments here. That was great. Thank you, Jamie said. It was definitely really, really helpful. I think in terms of, there's so much to learn, like you said, about mindful and intuitive eating. And it really is just like the tip of the iceberg. But I think the tips that you provided, I think we could all use because like you said, life kind of happens, and, just centering yourself and finding those little moments to slow down, even with food, I think can be really rewarding in different ways. One of which is digestion, which actually Patty has asked more of a reflection, curious to see how this can help my IBS, which I think is a really good point to talk about, kind of the relationship between mindfulness and digestion.
Oh yeah, that is such a great question, Patty. Thank you so much for asking that as well. And yes, as Noreen was talking about at the beginning of our conversation, a lot of information regarding nutrition and IBS, yes, really focuses on nutrition. So specifically FODMAPs, the different groups as well. There's definitely a lot of value when it comes to that conversation. But absolutely, there's a lot of research in terms of the effect in terms of stress, and any sort of emotions can definitely absolutely impact IBS and anything else digestive health related as well. A lot of times, the gut can be considered the second brain as well too, right? Um, so again, those can definitely maybe some factors to kind of help in terms of overall with IBS as well. So even anecdotally, sometimes people I speak with, they'll mention, you know what, I went on vacation, my stress was significantly reduced as well. And all of a sudden my symptoms were a lot more controlled. But as soon as I go back into my day-to-day and my week-to-week routine, it's almost as if I came back as well. So on the topic of that, for anybody that's interested in something that there is evidence behind it for IBS, but it's not necessarily related to specifically a low FODMAP diet, nutrition. If that is not something that you want to focus on or would be accessible for you, I've maybe an app to kind of take a look at is called Nerva. I'm just going to type it in the chat here as well. It's really evidence-based and really just kind of focuses in terms of increasing mindfulness in terms of IBS, digestion as well. Initially, I was very skeptical when I was taking a look at this. I thought, okay, no, it should all be about the FODMAPs, but there's a lot more to that. I think that we need to recognize as well too, but definitely a really great question.
Amazing. And for those that may have missed the introduction, Jackie does have quite a bit of experience in digestion and IBS, and it's actually the perfect segue. I was going to provide some information as to how to contact Jackie if you did have additional questions that maybe pop up after the webinar that you wanted to connect with her on, or booking kind of a discovery call with her or booking a visit. So I am going to put her online booking link here for anybody that is interested, as well as email address. And Jackie and one of our naturopathic doctors, Dr. DaCosta, are actually doing a really great sort of spring cleanse challenge beginning April 30th, actually. So just coming up on Sunday, to help you kind of get back into, a little bit of a groove with nutrition if you feel like the winter months were a little bit too long, or you feel like your body's just not at its best. A lot of the principles that Jackie talked about here, I think, could probably be used in a challenge like this, just in terms of sort of becoming more in tune with your body and not really just about the food that's being put in, but not just what you eat, how you eat. And Dr. DaCosta is also going to be leading a couple of community acupuncture sessions, as well as mindfulness sessions, to get you practicing some of that mindfulness throughout the spring challenge. Jackie will be providing some delicious, healthy recipes for those 10 days that the challenge will be for, as well as a complete grocery list to make the challenge as seamless as possible. So if you are interested in sort of getting a little bit more in tune with yourself as well as how you're eating, I'm also going to just add the link to the spring challenge if you do want to register in the chat box as well. So yeah, if there are there any other questions for Jackie? If not, we have just 7 minutes to spare, so that's great. You guys can enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We do these webinars on a monthly basis, so we will be doing another free webinar next month, with the date TBD, but we will inform everybody through our newsletter, through our social media platforms, and it will also be up on Eventbrite. The upcoming webinar will be led by one of our other directors, Dr. Yad Shergill, who is a chiropractic doctor, and she will be speaking on chronic pain. So if that's something that you are interested in or know anybody who would benefit from that education, feel free to forward that information to them. Thank you again. And thank you so much, Jackie, for taking the time. And we will be sending out the recording likely within the coming days.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for attending, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Yeah, have a good evening. Bye.